The classic Soviet-style block building is perhaps the most recognizable architectural symbol of the Soviet Union. These ubiquitous buildings, gray, boxy, and constructed from prefabricated concrete slabs, were originally designed to be the solution to a post-war housing crisis. Commonly referred to as Khrushchevka, these structures were part of a mass housing project intended to provide low-cost housing to the population. The construction was quick and efficient, but the quality of the materials used was often less than ideal. As a result, many of these buildings developed damp conditions, a problem that has persisted to this day. Individual housing projects were slow and not scalable to the needs of overcrowded cities. So to ameliorate a severe housing shortage, during 1947 and 1951, Soviet architects evaluated various technologies attempting to reduce costs and completion time. In January of 1951, an architects' convention supervised by the party director of Moscow decided the future of housing in the Soviet Union. They declared low-cost, mass-scale, industrialized construction processes relying on concrete panel plants and a quick assembly schedule, the objective of Soviet architects. During 1961, Lagutenko's Institute released the K7 design of a prefabricated five-story building that became typical of the Khrushchevka. The buildings were primarily constructed from the 1950s to the 1960s, which was a period of rapid industrialization and urbanization in the Soviet Union. During this time, the government wanted to build up cities quickly without spending too much money on housing for people who had just moved there. The Khrushchevka was thus meant to be a temporary solution until better housing could be built elsewhere. The design for these buildings was based on a plan developed by architects in 1951. They were intended for families who could not afford more luxurious apartments or houses, however they would still be able to live in their own homes instead of having to share with others or live in communal flats, which had been common practice before. These buildings were cheap, and sometimes an entire building could be constructed within 2 weeks. The Khrushchevka design represented an early attempt at industrialization and prefabricated buildings. With elements or panels made at concrete plants and trucked to sites as needed, planners regarded elevators as too costly and as too time-consuming to build. The Soviet health and safety standards specified five-story buildings as the maximum height without an elevator. Thus, almost all Khrushchevkas have 5 stories. Khrushchevkas featured combined bathrooms. Kitchens were small, usually 6 meters squared or just 65 square feet. This was also common for many non-elite class Stalinist houses, some of which had dedicated dining room. Typical apartments of the K7 series had a total area of 30 meters squared, or just 323 square feet for one room, or for 2 rooms, 44 meters squared, 474 square feet, for 3 rooms, 646 square feet, or 60 meters squared. Later designs further reduced these meager areas. These apartments were planned for small families, but in reality it was not unusual for 3 generations of people to live in 2-room apartments. The last 5-story Khrushchevka was completed during 1971. The rest of the USSR continued building them until the fall of the Soviet Union. Millions of such units are now past their design lifetime. In the early 1950s, the Soviet Union faced a housing crisis. The crisis had been triggered by Stalin's attempts at rapid industrialization of the mainly agrarian nation, which sent scores of rural migrants flooding into the cities to seek work without an adequate supply of housing to meet their needs. It was then exacerbated by the war, which left millions homeless across the country. To deal with the crisis, the Soviet Union implemented a nationwide compulsory housing program in 1953. A radical expansion of state-run housing construction projects. So as a result, the program helped repair a substantial portion of the damaged housing and constructed new housing units all over the country. By 1960, the number of people living in overcrowded houses had dropped by 32% compared to 1939 figures. By the same year, the average living space per person had increased by 40%, while the number of housing units in the Soviet Union had risen by nearly 50%. This large-scale housing program provided much-needed relief to millions of people and helped the Soviet Union tackle the housing crisis. In 1954, Khrushchev called for the industrialization of architecture as a means to deliver an urgently needed program of mass housing. The policy was informed by the ideas of Soviet urban planners such as the authors of The Ideal Communist City, an influential book written by members of the architectural faculty at the University of Moscow. Quote, "Today the city does not fulfill its essential purpose, which is to be an organic community. Seeking new approaches, architecture strives to create the city of the future. We must find a structure that responds organically to the social and economic functions of the new urban life." So this then raised the question, what should the city of the future look like? It has to be a place that nurtured communities. Nurseries would be walking distance from residential areas. There'd be theaters and sports halls nearby and ready access to public transport. Housing blocks would be modeled on the clean lines of modernist design instead of private homes, which the authors feared would lead for the Soviet citizen to separate himself from others and shun the collective responsibility of building socialism. People would live together in high-density apartments with shared facilities for cooking and eating. Here, in these new model developments, the Soviet man would thrive. Urban planning in the Soviet bloc countries during the Cold War era was dictated by ideological, political, social, as well as economic motives. Unlike the urban development in the Western countries, Soviet-style planning often called for the complete redesigning of cities. This thinking was reflected in the urban design of all communist countries. Most socialist systems exercised a form of centrally controlled development outlined in the Soviet guidelines at the end of the Stalinist period. The communist planning resulted in virtually identical city blocks being erected across many nations, even if they were different in the specifics between each country. Soviet-style cities are often traced to modernist ideas in architecture, such as those of Le Corbusier and his plans for Paris, who I talked about in my last video, What Happened to Our Skyscrapers. As one historian cited in The Human City wrote, the communist city was to be a place free of historical burdens, where a new human being was to come into existence. The city and the factory were to be a laboratory of a future society, culture, and way of life. The idea was compelling and swiftly adopted. Mass-produced buildings of reinforced concrete made quickly and cheaply to a standardized model were erected across the Soviet Union. Despite propaganda images of happy families and well-managed housing blocks, the reality was less inviting. Shoddily constructed, drably utilitarian, sleeping districts that dominated the urban landscape. By the end of the regime in 1991, industrialized housing made up 75% of all Soviet housing stock. The panel buildings are still found in great numbers all over the former Soviet Union. However, an updated high-rise version was built in the 1970s and 1980s, included many upgrades including larger apartments, particularly larger kitchens, elevators, and garbage disposals. This was then followed by what is known unofficially as the new construction, and is still built in the panel house type structure used in the Soviet Union, but are taller, have 21st century amenities, parking, more colorful and decorative designs, and are built over a much larger space area. So an example of this would be Khodrovo in Leningrad. Alright, so that's going to be all I have for you guys today. Please subscribe for more Squalid Suburbs, and thank you for watching.